Thank you. Right, welcome everyone to the SOLAR webinar series. SOLAR is the Society for Learning Analytics Research, and this is one of our initiatives to reach out to the wider community. We aim to make a range of topics available for the community by inviting researchers to share their work with you. And we ask researchers to provide a short presentation, and we also leave room for discussion at the end. And after today, we will post this webinar on our website, where you can also find all the previous webinars. So be sure to visit our channel. And if you haven't done so, to subscribe to our newsletter so that you get updates on the upcoming webinars. We are your hosts for today, myself, Anushka, and Isabel. Welcome. We're happy you're all here. The structure of the webinar is as follows. We will first explain a little bit about the communication rules. Then we will introduce our speaker, and she will present for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and all the remaining time will be spent on Q&A. So to let the webinar run smoothly, we have the following rules set up. Well, we first of all ask all of you to mute your mic during the talk, and we will open up the microphones again after the talk so that you can ask your question live. If you have questions for the presenter during the talk, please post them in the chat, and Isabel and I will keep track of your questions and ask them to Maria at the end of her talk. You can also save your question for at the end and raise your hand, and we will give you the floor to ask your question live. So that's it for the communication rules. Now I'm very happy and pleased to introduce our presenter. We're happy that Dr. María Rodríguez-Triana joins us today. I hope I said it correctly. Thank you. Maria is a senior researcher at the Center of Excellence in Educational Innovation, usually in Tallinn, at Tallinn University, but she just told me she's now visiting in Spain. So she's traveled around a lot, also in her in the earlier years of her career. And her work is characterized by a focus on innovation at multiple levels of education and in various contexts. For example, she has worked on projects concerning collaborative learning, inquiry learning, and also on projects concerning data literacy and data visualizations. And currently, she's working on a project related to the application of learning analytics, which has prompted us to invite her to tell us about that today. So we're happy she was willing to share her expertise with us. She will share her insights today about the role that data analytics can play in supporting design for learning. And she will do that using a learning design framework. So thank you, Maria, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Anushka. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Can you see my screen? Okay, super. So so as Anushka was mentioning, so you can guess also from my name that I am originally from Spain. So such kind of complicated name cannot come from anywhere else. And I belong to Tallinn University. I'm working there, even if now I'm doing a research stay with the University of Valladolid. So that's why I'm currently switching from one country to another. So as Anushka was mentioning before, in the last few years, I have especially been working in the connection between two areas, that is learning analytics and learning design. And so basically I tried to do, or to provide you a summary of what I've learned in the last few years, and try to give you some examples that could give you an overview of what is the topic about. So a little bit about the goals of this presentation, just to define your expectations. And so on one hand, I would like to give you to raise awareness about how analytics, not only learning analytics, but in general analytics, could help learning design, and to illustrate the synergies that could appear between these two areas. Then I would like also to synthesize what could be the takeaway messages and open the discussion with all of you, so that if you have questions or you want to I don't know. So to bring new ideas, it would be extremely welcome. So a little bit about definitions, and even if this presentation you wanted to have a lot of background. So I was talking before about learning design. So learning design is quite focused on assisting practitioners in the creation of pedagogically sound learning environments. But then in the title of this presentation, I was mentioning quite a lot about analytics, and I was not specifying what kind of analytics. Why did I do it? It was because, in fact, there are many different ways of referring to analytics. And we have the part of the learning analytics that is much more connected to SOLAR, that is understanding and optimizing the learning and the environment where it occurs. There are other trends that are focusing a little bit more on the teacher side of the story. Some others are focusing on academic analytics, people are more focusing on the community analytics. So all the lessons learned from these different areas could be helpful. So, but what is the issue that normally we are facing here is that everyone is targeting their own target, their own goal. And what is missing quite often is the lack of alignment between all these areas that, even if they have some differences, that they have a lot of interests in common, especially how to improve the learning environment from different perspectives. No? So, but this is basically what brought me to this topic of connecting design and analytics. So there have been a ton of researchers trying to promote this connection between these two areas from the theoretical perspective, from the practical perspective, and trying to explain what are the potential synergies that you could find when you try to align these two topics. So, but in order to understand what could be what kind of synergies we could find, sometimes it's easier to look at the challenges that these two sides have. So from the learning design domain, there are many people that are trying to understand what are the effects of the learning design, what are the characteristics, what the practitioners are doing when they are designing for learning. So there are many open questions, as they have been reported by several authors. On the other side, we have the people from analytics, and also they are facing some challenges, like the lack of contextual constraints when trying to understand the data, the need for connecting with the user practice, the ethical and privacy issues, the data literacy, the actionability of the analytics, and the need for assessing what is the added value that those solutions that we are providing have for the final users. So when we try to see how these two areas could help with each other, we could see that learning design could help most of these topics. So except for the ethical and privacy issues that obviously sometimes they are not so well connected with the learning design. So the learning design could offer the framework, could help us connect with the teacher practice, could help us understand, okay, how to present data that is relevant, how to make it actionable in terms of the decisions that need to be made, and also to better understand what is the added value that it will have. So if there are certain pedagogical goals, what is the value that analytics could bring to those analytical goals? And it happens the same to the other direction, that analytics could also help quite a lot to learning design. So analytics could help us to understand what is the impact of learning, of the learning design that we have created, so how it affects the students, what are the characteristics that the learning design they may have, and also to understand the process. So to focus a little bit on this presentation, so this connection that I'm presenting now, this is the one that I would like to address today. In order to structure it a little bit, with some colleagues a few years ago, we were defining the analytics layers for learning design framework. And this is what I'm going to use today, just in order to structure and to give you kind of different targets that we could have as researchers in our practice. So this framework, basically what it says is that we could try to understand that we could have 3 different layers, okay? So analytics, for instance, could help learning design in different levels. So in the bottom level, trying to understand what are the effects that the learning design have on the students, no? So whether the learning is improving or not, whether the pedagogical goals are achieved. So what is the engagement? So different issues that could emerge. Another aspect is what is design? So what are the characteristics that those learning designs have? So what are the decisions that are made by the practitioners? And in the higher level, another layer talks about how is the learning design process itself. So it's not so much about the artifact created, it's much more about how teachers reach this final artifact that finally will be implemented in the classroom. So in the following slides, what I will try to do is to talk a little bit about each one of these layers and provide you some examples that have been already proposed in the literature. And well, in this framework, we try to reflect on different topics. On one hand, was trying to understand what are the data sources that are informing a certain specific layer, what kind of data classes are used, metrics, and what is the purpose of that layer. So let's try to start from the bottom. So learning analytics, that probably is the one that is a bit closer to us. So in that level, what we could find is that normally the data sources that are used in the case of learning analytics are much more connected to the learning environment. What are the learning management systems that are used, the specific learning tools, what kind of sensors, sometimes also, yes, especially now, sensors are used more often, and the information systems from the universities. And also, apart from this data that is collected automatically, we could also use surveys. So in terms of data classes, what kind of information normally we extract from there? So on one hand, we could have the profile from the students, what kind of process they are following, their performance, whether they are satisfied or not with their learning experience, certain checking points that could be connected to the learning design. So for instance, whether they have reached a number of goals, a number of submissions, or well. And then related to the metrics that we could extract, typical ones are related to the engagement, to the progress of the student, to the achievement, and the satisfaction. So connected to the data classes that we were mentioning before. So what is the goal that learning analytics could have for learning design here? So on one hand is like raising the awareness and reflection, trying to trigger it about what is the learning design impact. And also, once we understand what is the impact that it could have on the student, we could also think about the redesign. So what we could do next year, basically, or in the following implementation of our own designs, in order to make it better or to avoid some problems or to increase the interest from the students. So this could be like kind of a summary of what is the learning analytics layer about. So let's try to see through some examples. So this is a work that Barrientes was doing with some colleagues at the Open University. And basically what they were trying to do was trying to understand how the learning design decisions could affect the engagement, satisfaction, and performance of the students. So in order to do that, what they did was to apply regression analysis to more than 100 models and trying to understand what was the connection with the students. Okay, so the behavior, satisfaction, and performance, and they had more than 100,000 students. So they had their own institutional virtual learning environment, and the main findings that they obtained were connected to the strong connection that they found as the learning design as a predictor of behavior, satisfaction, and performance. And the primary one that they found was that, for instance, if we try to understand what are the different kinds of activities that could be created in those modules, so they realized that communications, for instance, was the one that was especially connected to better academic retention. So this kind of understanding or lessons learned are the ones that we could obtain with application of learning analytics. Let's go for design analytics. So in this case, normally what we use as data sources are the learning design tools, or authoring tools also called, so digital ones normally. So what kind of information we can extract from these data sources? Normally it depends on how the authoring tools are modeling the learning design, but typical things are that we could find there are the goals, the tasks, the social plans, where the activity is going to take place, the timing, the load of teachers and students. So this kind of information. Then in terms of metrics, what we have been detecting normally are like trying to measure whether teachers are taking certain design decisions, like whether they are creating a number of steps or whether they're using a number of resources, or so many times are connected to structural decisions, but not always. So the main functions that we could find in this layer are especially related to reflect on how is the learning design and how it could trigger decisions in the future. So basically, if we understand what is the impact of the current decisions, then we could decide whether to change or design or not. So I understand that maybe the functions are not so clear, and I think that with examples we could understand much better what we could offer with this layer. So here we have work done with Laia Albó and other colleagues from the University Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona. So in this kind of a study, what they did was trying to understand what was the value of knowledge-based design analytics during the design process. So with knowledge-based design analytics, in this case, what they were doing was a kind of content analysis, trying to understand what kind of concepts were used in different phases of the learning design. Okay. So in this case, what they provided was a dashboard visualization where they could see how the different topics were associated to the different parts of the learning design. And this took place in Scrum, that is an authoring tool that is embedded in the ILDE. So I will talk about the ILDE later on, and you will have the links later when you have access to the slides. So what they learned in this case was that these kind of visualizations were helpful in different ways. So one thing was that the teachers could reduce the cognitive load because they realized about, okay, whether they were dealing with some concepts while, for instance, introducing the theoretical part, or while using them in the examples or in the activities. So it was facilitating a little bit the overall learning design. Another issue was that it was also helping the selection of activities that they wanted to integrate, and also it was improving the overall learning design quality according to the authors. And something that also the teachers were reporting was that it was helping them to avoid design errors. So as you can see, it's like, okay, so here's the goal. It was much more into, okay, teacher creating a learning design. So how we can help this teacher in order to improve the learning design that sooner or later will be implemented in the classroom. Another work that has been done in collaboration with Tom de Jong and other colleagues from projects like GoLab and NextLab was this paper that was trying to reflect on the design practices that teachers had. So basically, the interesting part of this study was also the scale of the study. In the same case that the paper that I presented before from Open University, they had a number of models with and the connection with a ton of students. Here we had many designs that we could analyze. And what we learned over here was that in the case of GRASP, that it was an authoring tool. So we could detect that, for instance, teachers were much more prone to create their own designs from scratch than reusing the learning designs that were already made by others or shared by experts. that another issue was that the co-creation was influencing quite a lot the design process and the characteristics of those learning designs. So for instance, another issue was that even if we were looking at the effort, so depending on how the co-creation group was structured, so depending on whether it was a single teacher, a group of teachers, or a combination between teachers and some project members that were helping, so the design time and also the content of the learning design was changing quite a lot. And another aspect that also we could learn was that those characteristics. So if we wanted to compare public ILSs from private ones that were used in the classroom, so the characteristics of each one of them were different. So these kind of patterns are also things that we could try to extract from this kind of layer of design analytics. And another paper, and I added this one because it was a bit different because of the kind of data that it was used. So before I was saying, okay, normally we use authoring tools. In this case, also they were involving sensor data. So they were using wearable devices. So they were having age trackers and also a mobile phone. So they could gather information from the gaze, from video, audio, and the accelerometer. So here, the interest was trying to understand, okay, what kind of data could be used in order to understand what is the orchestration process of a teacher. And for this information, they were comparing the learning design, so the lesson plan, with the actual enactment. So for instance, among the different things that they learned was that so machine learning models were quite successful in order to be trained with this kind of multimodal sensor data. And if we were using less costly data sources, they were still quite effective, because I understand that, for instance, eye trackers are not devices that we can find in every single school, but a mobile phone is something that is quite easy to use by any teacher. And the other thing that was quite interesting that we could learn, not only from the practical perspective or the technical perspective, was that there is normally a quite clear difference between the ideal plan, so how things are envisioned when we are designing our sessions, versus the real or final enactment in the classroom. So in this graph that appears on the left, we could compare that, okay, the ideal structure of the session versus how things happen in the bottom while the enactment took place. So this is something that many times we try to reflect quite a lot on the learning design, but we also need to compare what is the connection with enactment, because it's not exactly the same what happens, and because many unexpected events could pop up in the process. So let's go for the last layer of the framework. So in this case, this is the community analytics. So here normally, it's not only the fact that we focus on offering tools, we also try to understand the trend as a community, okay? So things that are normally providing information and different tools that could be embedded, the labels, the authors, the ratings that they could provide about the different designs that are shared. So whether they are providing feedback to each other, how they are communicating. Some metrics that we could obtain are the different patterns, as I was mentioning before, that we could observe in that community regarding their practice. And how we could use this information. So normally it again helps awareness and reflection, in this case about what are the learning design activity patterns. And also it could help the orientation and inspiration for the learning design activity. And this is especially valuable if we think about TEL developers, TEL providers, or teacher trainers. So if we understand how tools are used, it's much more easier to go to our training events, for instance, and try to help our teachers based on the weaknesses that they may have instead of the strengths that they already show. So if we are able to know what is the overall trend that we could find. Some examples. So this is again a paper from Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona. So in this case, the authors were trying to understand how the community awareness was facilitating the learning design activity of teachers. How they did it, it was through a dashboard, okay? And in this case, the technological context was the ILDE. ILDE is a compendium of different authoring tools. So teachers could use different authoring platforms and then try to implement the learning designs in the school or in the classroom. So, what kind of findings they have? So here, as I was mentioning, they created a dashboard, and what they realized was that the dashboard was useful when they were trying to summarize the activity of the community and trying to identify content and different member roles that they could recommend to other members of the community or other teachers. And also the fact that the teachers could browse around and they could try to understand what kind of content that people could be relevant for them was also raising the number of interactions among the participants. Another case was done also in the context of GRASP, and in this study, what we tried to do was to understand whether the social practices of the community were connected to the implementation of the learning designs. And in this case, we have like a bunch of 40,000 learning designs, and then we have like 35,000 teachers. So it was a very good opportunity for us in order to understand how a community practice that was big enough in terms of learning design was behaving. And what we learned over there was that when the social practices were higher, also the adoption of the learning design, meaning in this case, the implementation in the classroom, was also higher. And the chances basically were raising quite a lot. So for instance, in terms of social practices, we are talking about whether you are sharing or co-creating or publishing, for instance, your learning design, whether you are getting help from experts, or whether you are, for instance, instead of creating from scratch, you're reusing your learning design and trying to build on top of existing knowledge, okay? So, well, so this was kind of an overview of the different layers that we could find, but also we don't need to see the layers like independent elements. There could be interactions between the different layers and they could inform each other. So for instance, something that could happen is that the design analytics, so knowing what are the design decisions that normally teachers have, we could have a framework for the learning analytics. On the other direction, also the learning analytics could also help us to align it with the design intention, trying to improve the redesign of the teacher. So if we look at the connection between community and design analytics, it could be quite easy, because for instance, if we identify, as I was mentioning before, that for instance, some good practices in inquiry learning, for instance, could be to try to scaffold the different phases of the learning design. I could get some recommendations while doing my design that could give me some hints about, okay, what kind of apps I could use in order to make it more prone for scaffolding inquiry, or what are good practices for CSEL that could be implemented in my own learning design that maybe I was not aware. And well, so this is basically the idea that all the layers among themselves, they are offering some interactions that they could inform each other. So it's not a matter that they are totally isolated. So as a kind of a wrap up, so I tried to make it short so that we could discuss. So basically I was trying to present you this framework about learning design and how analytics could support it, and trying to show this kind of synergies. I'm missing one slide. Okay, here you go. So we have to wrap up. So let me go here. So for practitioners, sorry for the slide that I was changing the order. So for the practitioners, what are my takeaway messages that I would like to share? So first of all is that analytics can help you in your practice, not only to monitor and assess your students, that is the common thing that we are often using learning analytics for, but also to improve your learning design practice, to get new ideas about what you could do. If I would be a teacher trainer, what kind of information I could get from this kind of from this presentation? So basically, this that analytics can also help you in your practice when you are training other teachers, because you could identify what are their weaknesses, what are the strengths, and how you could help them in practice. Because when you're aware about the skills that your teachers have, it's much easier to know how you could guide them in the process. So for TEL providers, even if I've been presenting a number of ideas that have been proposed in the literature, there are not so many solutions that are currently available for final users. So many of them are studies that have been done, and then they raise or provide theoretical knowledge, but then there is a need for a startup and product ideas and final products that are much more sustainable and go beyond the typical thesis or a project that has been funded for up to 4 years. So some ideas for SOLAR researchers, especially for PhD students, that I guess that there could be a few of them over here. So there is a lot of room for supporting learning design stakeholders. So, and each one of the layers could give you some open questions that you could try to explore. So trying to understand how educators are designing for learning, that is the higher community analytics layer, where the design decisions and related aspects that characterize learning design, and then it could help you to guide the teachers in their decisions, and also how learning analytics could help us to assess the effect of the learning design decisions. So are our learning designs really effective, or are we reaching our learning goals? So these are open questions that in different pedagogical approaches are still open and need to be further explored. Another issue for all of us that sometimes we tend to remain quite connected to the data, and sometimes we are a bit far from the users, is that even if there is a lot of room for supporting these people, in order to support these people, we need to bring them in the loop. So it's quite important to understand what are their needs, what are their day-to-day, so each decision that they need to do, and how we could inform what they need to do. And in a little bit more in general for TEL researchers is that analytics could help us understand what is the pedagogical adoption of TEL innovations. So because quite often we are providing a number of solutions that they have a pedagogical intent. And then what we do is to say, okay, we have a lot of users in my tool. I'm quite happy, or oh my God, I have so few. I'm such a disaster. This has been a failure. But the quite important thing that we are forgetting is whether those TEL innovations, whether those solutions are used as they were expected. So are our users using or putting in practice those pedagogical approaches that we're trying to promote? So that's all from my side. I would be extremely happy to get some comments or questions from your side. And I hope the presentation was not so boring, especially for those that are just arrived from holidays and maybe they are thinking, oh my God, what I'm doing with my life, I want to come back to the beach. But in any case, so open from your ideas.
Yes, thank you, María Jesús, for your talk. It generated a lot of discussion in the chat. Yeah, some applause I saw from Anushka, but before we wrap up, actually we have plenty of time for discussions. Now I'm going to allow you to unmute your microphones, and there were already some questions from Alex. So do you want Alex to do your questions by yourself, or you prefer us to ask the questions on your behalf?
He'd like you to ask them, Isabel.
Okay,
yeah, I think that Alex.
Yeah, I saw the chat. Okay, I'll do it. So the first question, it's about well, he would like to hear more about learners' data literacy when it comes to the data that they provide to learning analytics. And the second question, well, maybe we can start by that. So what's your take about learners' data literacy regarding learning analytics applications?
So I guess that I can speak a little bit more about Europe than about other areas. I think that there is a lot of emphasis currently in order to encourage schools and trying to reinforce researchers in order to raise the awareness among students about what kind of data is collected. So this is the first step. So what kind of data is collected is part of the data literacy, and then we can start talking about what analytics is saying about it. And another issue is to explain to students to be able to be critical. And this goes, I don't care whether it's a teacher, whether it's a student, whether it's any other stakeholder. So we need to understand what kind of data is collected, whether the data that we have is reliable, and whether the analysis that are being applied make sense from our own context. So I think that is something that is progressively developed. Still, for me, I think that is a work in progress thing. We are not all of us used to rely on data, even if evidence-based learning teaching is something that is you could find in it, no matter what kind of report. In practice, it's not so common. So we have now COVID, and you have a lot of information that is not evidence-based, and people share the information and trust no matter what. So one way or another, I think that is something that needs to be further developed. But I think that in general, there is a concern that this is necessary. So, well, that would be my comment on that side.
Yeah, thank you for your comment on that. Definitely there is it's a work that as we progress, there is more to be done, but in a way also the progress that we have already done has helped the community to become more conscious. There is a second question about when it comes to data, using learning experience design, how might we bridge the gap between the higher ed and learning and development? I mean, as disciplines or in practice and research?
Well, I think that one of the main issues that I've been seeing is that it's easy to find, normally, people willing to try things and to put in practice new ideas or to test whether this new approach could fit. So we have these kind of teachers that are always like open-minded to things that are a bit less secure or less stable. But this is a very small percentage of the population, if we are honest. And I would say that this is quite connected to one of the comments that I was making at the end, that we have many proposals that remain at the research stage, and we are able to prove that something was helpful for a certain context, but then we are not moving one step forward in order to bring it to a sustainable product that people could have and rely on. So the fact that our tools, many times they have bugs, that they need a researcher close by in order to make them work. So all these issues are complicating quite a lot the large-scale adoption. So why some studies that have been done with Moodle, for instance, are much more useful than others? So basically because we have a ton of users that working in Moodle, and maybe you just need to develop a plugin and many people can use it, and if it's reliable, people already are working in a context that they are comfortable with, and nothing is so there is no negative impact on them quite often. So it's not like, oh my God, I have my lesson was planned and then it was a failure and I couldn't provide whatever thing that I wanted to do that day. So I think that we need to understand that people can risk a little bit for a certain amount of time, but it cannot be the normal basis. So we need to to understand that all of us, we would like to reach our office or go to our job and say, okay, I know that I will find what I was expecting. So I was planning to do this and I managed to do that. So I think that this is the main issue that is blocking the adoption of innovations. So the need of pushing for the ideas of creating startups and creating more tools that can be connected to the real users, not the sporadic ones.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, definitely there is a challenge in supporting adoption like long term. So there was another question from the chat from Olumide. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. There you are. Do you want to make it or you prefer that I do it?
Sure. Just wondering about writing analytics, the analysis of student writing and its relation to the different success measures. Where would that fit into the ALFLD model?
So it depends. So it depends what you would like to do. So for instance, something that you could do is that, okay, so you may have writing analytics, but I guess that the students are producing this text, these artifacts with a number of goals. It could be self-defined, it could be defined by the teacher. So for instance, a way that you could have in order to relate it is like whether the pedagogical goals of the teacher are being achieved by the students. So this is something that you could inform. So this you could find it in the learning analytics level, so the lowest layer. So I'm saying that just the lowest because it's how it's located, not because it's less important. Okay, so this is something, for instance, that I don't know. So you may have a number of criteria of success about, okay, what a good piece of text should have, and then understanding whether students are achieving it or not. You as a teacher, you could decide, okay, so maybe I need to make a number of clarifications at the beginning because all the students are struggling with certain tasks, or I don't need to devote so much time in order to introduce this activity because everyone is doing it super easily. So in a couple of minutes, they grasp the idea and they go ahead. So this is the kind of feedback that, just thinking like from the top of my mind, I could think of.
Okay. Yep. Okay. What about something like sentiment analysis? If I can squeeze in another quick question, sorry. Something about sentiment analysis of student writing. For example, in reflective writing, there are opportunities to see more into the emotional side of students learning. Any thoughts on how that might connect to other aspects of the ALFLD layers?
So in the same case that you could think about what is the impact on learning in terms of achievements, you could have connections with, and I was mentioning engagement also as one of the potential topics. So obviously sentiment analysis is not exactly the same that engagement, but in any case, maybe you could identify frustration in certain aspects, or so you could identify a number of trends, and then as a teacher you could reflect, okay, maybe I need to intervene because the situation is deviating quite a lot from my expectations. So also the sentimental analysis could give you some hints, I guess. I think that it depends on what is the purpose of the activity itself. But different kinds of analytics could give you metrics or ideas about different trends among the students that you could connect with your own goals, or where you would like to guide the students to.
Okay, thanks very much, Maria.
Thank you for your question.
Yes, there are more questions in the chat, so we have been keeping track. There is one from Yin regarding data literacy and the students. Like the concern, it's about the cognitive load imposed on learners or teachers who are already overwhelmed with the process of teaching and learning itself. So what mode of training do you think it's more effective for teachers and learners who need to use learning analytics in practice?
I think that the issue is that sometimes we need to change the question. It's like, okay, our goal is not having teachers using learning analytics. or teaching analytics or whatever, or students, the goal is that they need a number of decisions to be made. So the easiest is the path to reach those decisions, the better, or as they are better informed, so they will be more successful in their own practice. So if we try to envision the situation according to, okay, what do you need to do? You need to do this decision, this another decision. So let's try to see how this tool is helping you to make these decisions. So instead of trying to teach someone else, so do you see this diagram? What is the meaning of this diagram? Try to guess. So it's the other way around. So it's like, okay, how this kind of information can guide your decision making, how we can do evidence-based decision making, how you can really understand what is happening around you, so that then you can reflect, you can have more informed practices. So for me, that would be the issue. It's like trying to change the angle a little bit, and instead of trying to convince someone about using analytics, would be the other way around. So so what is your need? Let's see how these kind of solutions could fit your case. So that would be my strategy for training.
Great, thank you for that. There is a question from Owen. Owen, would you like to do it?
Yeah, I can do it. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Maria, for a very interesting talk and for hosting us today. Yeah, so you outlined, I'm particularly interested in the idea of community analytics, and you outlined some of the sources of data in your paper. So you talk about the design tools being used, types of design being created, and so on and so forth. Could you speak a bit more about your own experience of that and the kind of successes or problems you've seen in your in helping people in their community of practice, or for helping them to interact? Because that I'm particularly interested in increasing participation through the use of learning analytics, and I'd just like to hear more about your experience of that. Thank you.
Well, so I would say that the first part of the story was that, as one of the authors said, was that was not a path of flowers and roses. So it was a pain trying to understand data that was not devoted to be used in that sense. So we had that platform. We were collecting data in order to sustain the platform, but then trying to make sense of the data was quite difficult. And going from the raw data to the interpretation of the data in terms of pedagogical decisions was not straightforward. And you cannot make them, or we couldn't at least, we couldn't make like super strong statements based on it, because, well, so what you could infer in order to be honest was not so deep. So it's like, okay, so you need to take things with a pinch of salt. And so that was part of the story. So in terms of how to make sense out of it in a real case. Another issue was that the motivation that we had was that for a long term, I was trying to help teacher trainers in that context. So for me, due to my own background, was like, man, we are trying to help teachers and we don't know where are their needs. So maybe we are providing a ton of trainings based on these topics, but maybe these are not the ones that they need, honestly. So, or we don't know how many teachers are being trained versus those that have at the end implemented lessons in their own school. So that was for me my interest and why I wanted to explore this area. And in that case, for instance, I think that it was quite helpful for us in order to understand the community that we were facing, because it was like, okay, so you could have a very successful platform, but in which sense? Because you have many users, or why? So how you are able to understand whether the pedagogical adoption was really there. So it was not just technological adoption, like, okay, you have a lot of users, but maybe they're using it for other purposes. So that was my experience. So first, that the sooner you start thinking about how you want to understand the community, the better, because you can collect data that makes much more sense to you. And you need to have either people from the two sides, so helping the teachers and also from the technological side, but you also need to have bridges in the middle that are able to understand how the pedagogical decisions are at the end translated into data, because you will need to aggregate information. And then data is not the holy grail. So normally I would say that if you really want to understand the data is opening a little bit Pandora's box, and is giving you a hint about, okay, here it seems that there are trends and there are real cases happening in this or that direction. But then you need to talk to the final users in order to know, okay, so now what? What is the meaning of this? So why this happened? Because maybe you are assuming that, okay, so a few people were using a certain functionality that for you was crucial, but you don't know why. Maybe it was because they didn't realize that it was so important. So maybe you just need to emphasize it a little bit in the process. So maybe the process was not so obvious in terms of, okay, you need to pay attention here from the technical perspective. So maybe it was, so the user interface was not helping in that, or maybe something that you need to reinforce in the trainings. So then there are different kind of solutions or strategies. And well, so I think that would be my takeaway message, that sometimes we are designing for any pedagogical approach, or we are trying to support it and to encourage teachers, and then we don't realize about how they are applying it. It's like, okay, we already trained a ton of teachers. We were super successful. And they told us that 1,000 were using it in the classroom, but we don't know what they did. So I think that moving a little bit forward in our evaluations, I think that it also happened in general learning analytics a few years ago, that we had many proposals, but then the evaluations were many times about the whether users were satisfied or not with the experience, whether they would use it or not. But then we are not, and you could see whether they are using them in the long term. So the progress of the community was allowing it. But another issue is like, okay, so and what was the change? So what happened with it? Did you change something? Were people really adopting it and putting it into practice? So I think that those are aspects that I would put an eye on it if I would have this kind of community around me.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
So through the chat, there was another question coming from Scott. And the question was, if we can't overcome the scaling limitations of encouraging explicit learning design using specialist tools, where are we when it comes to the reverse engineering of implicit design from delivery?
I guess that the question goes a little bit connected that, okay, so many people are not doing so many learning designs, and sometimes you reach the classroom and basically put your knowledge into action and you do what I can and do what you can. And this goes a little bit connected to the paper that I presented by Prieto, that even if you may have a learning design plan, the enactment is another issue. So could be a similar story, but it's not the same. So there are also a number of solutions that we could use in order to infer what was the overall structure. So what was the practice about? So as we saw in that case, with multimodal data, we could try to understand how was the orchestration graph. So whether you are monopolizing as a teacher the lecture, or there is a debate and there is a kind of balance between the individual and the group work. So this could also help us, even if we don't have a learning design. So it could help us to understand, okay, how was my lesson today? Let me think a little bit. And then you reflect on what happened that day, and you may decide, okay, so maybe tomorrow I try a different thing. So it's not that you have an implicit lesson plan that you can use, but in any case, it could help you while performing your lessons. Did I answer you, Scott? It was from Scott, that question, no?
Yes, Scott Wilson.
Yeah, that's correct. That's kind of what we were getting at, is that when we're looking at scaling, a lot of these tools like Grasp and so on, if you can get like 0.1% of teachers to use them, you feel very successful. But then we look at scale. So we currently are serving some like 160 universities with analytics. And when we analyze their data, we just don't know what the teachers are doing, because we just get things like course codes and numbers and so on, but we don't know what was the design. We can get it from a small sample if they've explicitly made a design and published that and connected it to the course details. But yeah, it's kind of, if we assume that we can't have mass adoption of explicit design tools, then those techniques you're describing of how do we conjure up some sort of implicit design from the history of the activity that's taken place, maybe that's the only way we'll get to the stage of having this evidence-based learning design that we can use from the analytics.
And something that we are doing also in that direction, so thanks for mentioning it, Scott, was that, okay, so we have also realized that even if you try to analyze the learning designs, you face a limit or a limitation when it comes to privacy, because it's like, okay, you can start tagging those learning designs that you have access to. So those that are public, those that have been published in a certain repository, things like that. But how do you deal with the others? So it's like, okay, structural things are somehow easy to analyze, but what about the content that is inside? So, and we think, so now we are exploring a little bit that area, and we are also using like machine learning in order to learn ourselves how to analyze that bunch of data. So because you are still preserving the privacy of these people, so you are not opening their learning designs as a human, so you are not assessing whether they were, so what kind of content they had. So the only thing that you are trying to understand is like, okay, based on a number of learning designs that you may have access, or content that you have access, you can train some algorithms in order to analyze the other black box that is in the community. So this is also something that could be done in order to understand not only those things that are easily accessible or visible, and also I think that some people that were mentioning it a bit more from the area of multimodal learning analytics was this street light effect, that sometimes we are only looking at the place where the light is going, but we are not looking around that maybe is interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. We analyze the data we have rather than the data we need. That's right. But I think this is really good. And I think our experience was that trying to take things like Davinia's framework and other things into kind of into production, basically, it just doesn't seem to be quite ready yet. So we definitely need to do a lot more work in the research side to try and understand some more of these issues.
Yeah. So thank you, Scott, for your question.
So just because we're about to close, I shared a 1-minute survey, a link throughout the chat. So we will be happy to receive feedback from you. And also I will post the link if you want to stay in hand regarding our announcement from Solar. You can join the mailing list of our society. And having said that, and inviting everyone to provide us feedback and to join our mailing list, we're about to run out of time, so I would like to thank María Jesús for this webinar session. Generated a lot of discussion through the chat, through the final question. Thank you for being so generous in order to leaving a lot of time so people could ask plenty of questions. And I hope that everybody enjoyed the discussion and that this session will keep you inspired in your research and in your practice. So round of applause for our speaker.
So thank you so much, Isabel and Anushka, for inviting me today.
Thank you, Maria.
Being so kind with my timing and all that, what was also quite flexible and useful for me. So it was very,
everyone for joining. And thank you, Maria, once again for joining us.
Okay, take care. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.